Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Liam. It's nice to meet you. I'd also like to thank my Coast Salish hosts. I'm very new to this territory. I just came here from Toronto by way of Colorado, where I was born. So I feel like a little bit of an outlier here. I'm a lit guy. So this is, it's a real honor to be able to participate and talk a little bit about these issues, but I'm definitely talking about them from a pretty distinctive perspective, but I think one that is quite complementary to the discussion today and to a lot of the policy concerns that you have. Because I'm a lit guy, my experience with a lot of these matters is not just personal. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'm also gay. But it's also professional because a lot of my students who come into an Indigenous literature class are engaging a lot of the legacies of residential schools, of colonization in general, but especially Two-Spirit queer Native students are encountering a whole other range of issues and erasures that sometimes coming into a class where Indigenous literature is present, it's an opportunity for them to see themselves for the first time in a way that's not dysfunctional or a way that's not blaming of themselves or others. So this presentation kind of takes that up a little bit. The world is full of big lies that dominate much of our lives. Love is weakness. Greed is good. The earth is a thing. You can bomb people into loving you, and so on. Most of what we know about Indigenous peoples in popular culture is also composed of big lies, and we know them too well. One of them is the savage, this cunning, ruthless, mindless, feral animal standing in the way of progress and civilization. Also, the vanishing, that Indigenous peoples no longer exist or only exist in diminished form. But to my mind, the most corrosive big lie is the nothingness. The nothingness is connected to the savage and the vanishing. It says that Indigenous people don't have intelligence, art, culture, sophistication, history, hearts, minds, passions, and joys. That we are passive receptacles with nothing of our own to fill. The lie says that we have no creative impulse, no complexity, and no capacity to love or be loved. The nothingness presumption claims that we had no cities before Europeans showed up, which is not true. It says that we have no real languages, which also not true. No real arts, only crafts. No nations, only wandering tribes. No real literature, no real culture, no real humanity. And sometimes we believe this big lie. Sometimes we are trained by our teachers, our schools, our politicians, our newspaper columnists, our professionals, academics, to see ourselves in a state of perpetual and unending lack. To believe that we and our families and our communities are defined by absence of culture, of history, of memory. Some of you may be aware of a book that came out just a couple of years ago from an academic press called Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, which was an argument that Indigenous peoples lived in a state of Neolithic cultural, in a cultural state, a Neolithic cultural state, when Europeans showed up. And it's just been kind of our hardwired Neolithic essential nature that has kept us from advancing along with the rest of the modernized world. That it came from a university press was quite striking. Big lies are corrosive. And when we and our families are already dealing with the ruptures of history, and I think that Rocky's presentation gives us a really good example of how profoundly catastrophic those ruptures can be. And when we're disconnected from land, language, and community in whatever way that might happen, then we might be prone also to believe in the nothingness. Especially when so much of the culture in which we exist needs to believe in Indigenous deficiency to avoid acknowledging the full horrors of colonialism. But in our stories, we have always been creative. Our stories tell us that we have always been intellectual, that we have always had the capacity to love, that we have always been committed to imagining a better world and to fulfilling the instructions and the teachings that we've been given. The lie of the nothingness hides a stark and terrible truth. Whatever we might lack was not because it wasn't once there. Whatever we might lack was taken from us. These things did not happen accidentally. They were part of government policy, religious practice, educational prescription. They were created, facilitated, encouraged, empowered, and enforced by colonial agents to whom the very existence of indigenous difference was abhorrent. They worked very hard to erase the evidence of our strength and of our richness, and to convince themselves and indigenous people that these things had never existed in the first place. We are still struggling to see these things realized in the world around us and in our lives. Indigenous peoples remain marginalized in film, in literature, in culture, in politics. While in BC the situation is somewhat better than in some other places in Canada. I came from Ontario, where Indigenous peoples are particularly invisible, and that's better than in other places in Canada. Aboriginal peoples still have to fight to be heard above the din of settler priorities. And if this is the case for Indigenous peoples as a whole, it is substantially more so for queer, two-spirit, LGBT Native people. And this erasure has very deep roots that go well before the residential school period. In 1513, I'm not going to go through every decade, I promise. In 1513, Vasco da Gama, a failed Spanish entrepreneur turned conquistador and explorer, led his soldiers against the village of Quareca. After slaughtering and dismembering the chief, Porque, and over 600 of his warriors, Balboa turned his attention to the house of this king, which was, quote, infested with most abominable and unnatural lechery, end quote. There he found, quote, the king's brother and many other young men in women's apparel, smooth and effeminately decked, by which the report of such as dwelt above him he abused with preposterous Venus. So in other words, they were getting it on. Balboa ordered that the men, who numbered around 40, be fed alive to his hunger-maddened war dogs. Infested, abominable and unnatural lechery, disease, death, and deviance. This is the measure of queerness in the conflict zone between Indigenous people of Quareca and the Spanish raiders. And the response? Torture, dismemberment, obliteration. In 1583, the Third Provincial Council of Lima, the colonial administration in what is now Peru, declared that, quote, sodomy, whether with another man or with a boy or a beast, carries the death penalty, and the reason God has allowed that you, the Indians, should be so afflicted and vexed by other nations is because of this vice that your ancestors had and many of you still have. So because there were queer folks in their midst, they were responsible for their own colonization. I'm sure we all know that there's a long history of persecution in the Americas against alternative sexualities and diverse gender expressions. To imagine that that has ended today would be obviously a lie. But it's also important to point out that oftentimes when it still happens to Indigenous people today, it's still made invisible. There's still a wall of silence. Think back to Matthew Shepard and his death in Wyoming. Around the same time, 16-year-old F.C. Martinez Jr., a Navajo two-spirit who lived in Cortez, Colorado, was beaten and left to die of blood loss and exposure in the pits, a ravine only a mile away from Cortez. His murderer, Sean Murphy, was a young white man who crushed F.C.'s skull with a rock and later bragged to his friends that he had bug-smashed a fag. About a year later, a Diné two-spirit youth, Raymond Luce, Raymond Seuss, disappeared from the clubs in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. His naked, broken body was found on a remote road in northeast Phoenix. And another year later, Alejandro Lucero, a Hopi Two-Spirit, was strangled to death and dumped in the same area. These did not reach the same level of international attention or outcry. These are the legacies of colonial persecutions of bodies and of pleasure. And of course, the question, how many in BC? How many in Vancouver? How many in our neighborhoods? The colonial system is one that has historically used sex as a weapon. Andrea Smith's book, Conquest, provides a really good analysis of rape as a practice of colonialism as an intentional rape as a weapon of colonialism. And we also hear about this elsewhere in conflict zones. Colonialism is in large part an exercise of both symbolic and literal rape, with women's bodies as the site of conquest and possession, and not just women's bodies. Yet colonization has also pathologized pleasure, and perhaps most insidiously made indigenous peoples associate our bodies with pain, with dysfunction, and with degradation. And I think the presentation with residential school, this was an intentional effect. Make people ashamed of their bodies. Blame them for their violation. When the body is a source only of wounding, then sexuality becomes a primary site of both colonial intrusion and decolonizing activism. And that's where I want to go now. We have a lot of examples of the horrors. But what do we do about it? How do we intervene? I'm a lit guy. One of the ways I do it is I teach. And I teach our literature. I teach our stories. And that's one thing that I believe is a help. And it's one thing that I believe is really useful, even when funds are being starved, even when policy is going against us. The nothingness convinces us that we don't have stories. The nothingness convinces us that we don't have histories. But when we realize we do, that can bring a lot of healing. It can bring a lot of community. It can bring a sense of belonging that no amount of funding can replace. Funding's great. I'm not saying don't go for the funding. But the stories are important too. And in many ways, the stories will sustain us when the vagaries of funding can't. So given this context, what are the interventions for mental and spiritual health? If, in the context of residential schools and other colonialist policies and practices, the big lie of the nothingness works to undermine our basic sense of self, belonging, and dignity, then part of the undoing of that legacy is to look for presences, for representations of diverse sexualities and of healthy, loving pleasure, for the other wounded and hungry kinfolk who can participate in that healing process. This can't be done alone. And the nice thing about these stories is the stories necessarily connect us, because in the sharing of stories, we are working across bodies. We are creating community. And indigenous peoples are communal people. And we have a lot of allies. And that builds that community even more. And we need that community. We need those communities to undo the ravages of colonialism. So I was hoping to make photocopies, but I was rushing to get here. But I've been collecting with other colleagues a list of literature and resources of Two-Spirit queer Native Lit and secondary sources. And right now we are at 7 pages single-spaced, which is substantially more than when I first came out. In many ways, it doesn't necessarily seem like a lot, but for us, this is huge, especially because much of this has been opened up in the last decade. So I brought a whole bunch of books here today. I just want to talk a little bit about the archive. We have a lot of creative work. We have novels, we have plays, we have poems, we have creative nonfiction, we have films, we have songs. These are the contemporary creative expressions, but in a lot of traditions we also have prayers, we have stories, we have traditions. When I teach these works in my classrooms, and when I have students who are struggling, whether they're Two-Spirit or not, they're struggling with seeing themselves as people with not just a past, but with a future. To know that these stories are out there, in book form, in film, to know that there are other people asking these questions and to talk about that. I have seen that have a transformative impact. It's had a transformative impact on me. Because the nothingness tells us we have nothing. That we are these toxic queers who suddenly plopped out of nowhere. We are the evidence of colonialism. We are the evidence of dysfunction. In a lot of our communities believe that queer desire came with Europeans. So in a lot of our communities, decolonization is actually homophobic because it says that we don't belong, which is a really sad case. It's not the universal response. A lot of our elders and a lot of our community members are embracing that diversity. But in some communities, and my community would be one of those, in 2007, we passed a ban on same-sex marriage. And there's a lot of commentary in that constitutional, well, not the constitutional, in the law that said this is not our tradition. This came with white people. There are a lot of our traditional people who might take issue with that. To have these stories, to have this archive, to respond to that nothingness is in and of itself transformative. But it's not enough. It's not enough just to see the fact that you exist. Sorry, that got a little loud all of a sudden. It's also important to see a diverse range of representations. And two books I wanted to talk about were Thompson Highway's Kiss of the Fur Queen and Craig Womack's Drowning in Fire. Highway's book takes up the residential school history and the sexual abuse that took place there. And one character, Gabriel, his sense of queer identity emerges out of his abuse as a student in residential school. In Drowning in Fire, which is set in Oklahoma among two gay Creek men primarily, it's a very, very different history and a very different experience of queer desire. Whereas the toxic queer concept is still very much part of Highway's book. In Womack's book, they're dealing with a lot of issues, and they're dealing with a lot of homophobia. But its desire is about transformative love. Both books have characters who are struggling and encountering the prejudice around HIV. But only in one book is there the capacity for a future and for survival. Not all of the stories that are out there are ones that affirm our presence. Some continue those stories. So they're still part of that archive. They're still part of that tradition. But what we need is not just a few stories. We need as many stories as possible so that we can see as many possibilities for transformative participation in the world. I had a student who did a presentation on Drowning in Fire, a Lebanese Canadian student, who in the middle of his presentation just started sobbing. He wasn't an Indigenous student, but this was the first book that gave him a sense that as a man of color, as a gay man of color, he had not just a future, but a future, the potential of future with love and with partnership and with passion. Our works can transform other people's lives as well. Indigenous literature by queer LGBT Two-Spirit writers is a response to the nothingness and the vanishing. It affirms the fact that queer Indigenous peoples are here. It affirms it to both settler society and to our own communities, which have sometimes come to accept the lie of either our toxicity or our erasure. And it affirms it to ourselves to remind us that we're not alone, that we belong to one another, that our rightful inheritance is one of love and pleasure, not hate and pain. And that no matter what we've experienced, what we've struggled against, and what we've suffered, that we are beautiful. And that, to my mind, is one of the most important gifts we can give one another and ourselves. That's one step that takes us a long way toward healing and well-being. And that's a vital way of honoring our ancestors, our families, and our obligations as queer Indigenous peoples today. And I'm happy to get people's emails and send a list of resources. And at the end, if you'd like to take a look at any of these works, I'd be happy to share those with you. But thank you very much.